With AI help, I feel very because we're all human. In terms of will, it's dangerous. I've already noticed this. I had an email from a young leader. I read the email 2 times. This is AI-generated email. That for me is the biggest worry culturally. Are we having people just have AI? Really?
Well, I do have because I just couldn't use this one speaking.
But that's not happening. People are saying, write me an email that has this term. Like, how do we do that? Like, absolutely. It doesn't like we're, to your point, like, we're giving ourselves to it. Your fact is it's no longer I'm doing a series for our marketing folks, and I'm going to be talking about this. It's not about it. The hope would be if it helps you see, oh wow, I can write like this.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Dr. Christopher Ragusa. I'm an assistant professor of theology here at FranU and the coordinator of the Bioethics lectures. Thank you all for coming out this morning. We had many people register, so there may still be people filtering in the back as we start. FranU is a university that firmly professes that it is only by faith and reason together that the human spirit can rise to the fullness of the truth. In a special way, we look to St. Francis as model disciple of Jesus Christ, as a witness to the way that a life of faith and reason lived for God offers us the ability to live life to its heights and to serve the poor and suffering among us. In a special way, these bioethics lectures aim to advance that mission at the heart of all that we do. And so again, thank you for coming out to the lectures this morning. We're so happy that you joined us for this second of our two-part lecture series, with its focus, this talk being on the ethics of genetic technologies at the beginning of life. However, before we continue, I'd like to begin this, as we do all things, with a prayer. In particular, I would like to use the prayer that St. Francis composed for Brother Leo for praying before the crucifix. So let's take a moment to quiet our hearts and our minds. To recall that we are always in God's presence. And to especially when we pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart. Give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity, understanding and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. Amen. Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Some quick housekeeping notes. Our speaker will give her lecture for approximately 50 to 55 minutes, and afterwards we'll have some time for Q&A. If you haven't done so already, please make sure to sign in using one of the QR codes in the back, especially if you're a student, and especially if your professors have offered you extra credit, so that we can make sure to have the accurate head count. At the end of today's lecture, please also be sure to fill out the survey through the QR code that will appear at the end of the slides. For those here for the Reach Badge program, please be sure to check in with Professor Richard, about what is needed to fulfill your requirements for the certificate. There are also refreshments available in the back of the room. Finally, if you'd like to support the continued good work of the bioethics lectures through spiritual or financial support, I would be happy to speak to you at your convenience. Friends, it is my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Mariele Courtois as our esteemed lecturer this morning. Dr. Courtois is a theological biomedical ethicist whose research interests include genetic engineering, healthcare, and technology ethics. She's an assistant professor of moral theology and the director of the Center for Technology and Human Dignity at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. Dr. Courtois is a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Culture and Education's AI Research Group and a contributing author of their books, Encountering Artificial Intelligence and Reclaiming Human Agency. Indeed, it's precisely on her specialties, namely that of genetic technologies, that she will be addressing us this morning in her lectures. And so, without further ado, it is my joy to welcome Dr. Mariele Courtois, who will be speaking on the ethics of genetic technologies at the beginning of life.
Thank you so much for Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Dr. Ragusa. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, and I'm very grateful to have been invited to speak at the wonderful institution of FranU. This particular topic is one that I find important to how we view our relationships to each other and to our family members, and influential on our perceptions of vocations of Christian positions. But further, it impacts how we view the relationship of the human person to the divine vocation. Today I'll talk to you about some of the concerns that come to light in conversations about the ethics of genetic testing, genetic screening, and genetic engineering. Many of you may find this topic interesting if you are in the healthcare field or plan to enter into the healthcare field, if you have an interest in research fields, or perhaps if you are a fan of Jurassic Park. But everyone should find this topic pertinent to one's own life, because at some point you may face ethical questions about genetic therapies that will affect you or generations beyond. You formed me in my inmost being. You knit me in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my very self you know. These are the words of Psalm 139, where the work of divine intention in the creation of each unique human individual is celebrated. The knitting imagery of new human life is demonstrated in the image on this screen here. But what if I told you that such an image was located in an IVF center? Does this seem to be a fitting or surprising setting? Whose hands do we imagine at the needles, making such fine decisions and movements toward the formation of the child? By encroaching upon the process of reproduction, do we put ourselves in the place of God? Do we become the creators where we are called to be receivers? What response is called from the child, who in the psalm is depicted as praising the one who makes her and knows her fully? when the one who makes her is another human, even her parent. This talk will have 4 main parts helping to explore these tensions and questions. First, I will describe the current uses of genetic technologies in medicine, and I will also describe the relevance of the therapy enhancement distinction. Then I'll highlight some of the ethical questions, and finally explain what responsibilities come into play for the parental vocation for genetic ethics. So first, to describe some current uses of genetic technologies in medicine. Our current state of genetic technologies include screening tests, which indicate the likelihood of a genetic disorder according to carrier screenings conducted on the parents or relatives, and using ultrasounds, for example, to determine potentially significant physiological markers. Screenings cannot definitively confirm a diagnosis, however. Genetic testing can confirm the presence of a genetic disorder, and techniques might include amniocentesis, which tests the amniotic fluid at about 15 to 20 weeks, or chorionic villus sampling, which tests the placental tissue at 10 to 12 weeks. It's also possible to utilize the non-invasive fetal sequencing, which can determine the nucleotide sequence of the suspended DNA in the mother's blood, which is a less invasive approach. But one can also use whole genome sequencing to determine the complete DNA sequence of an individual. It's important to note, however, that DNA cannot provide the complete picture about the health of the individual, as the expression of a genotype as the phenotype is impacted further downstream. It can be impacted by biochemical processes or by epigenetic factors, including the environment. One important context for thinking about genetic technologies at the beginning of life is in vitro fertilization, which involves a process of creating an embryo in a petri dish utilizing human gametes. One of the reasons that this method is morally fraught from a Catholic moral perspective is because it separates the unitive, that is the embrace and collaboration more fully understood toward holiness between the spouses, and then separates that from the procreative ends of the welcoming of children, which are the 2 goals of marriage. And it permits relating to one's spouse and child as objectified material. It's important to note that the magisterial condemnation of in vitro fertilization does not mean that the children born from this method have any less dignity. Rather, it's on account of the great dignity of these children and their belovedness by their families and by God that this means of reproduction is viewed as unfitting. In the process of in vitro fertilization, there's often embryo selection. The embryos that seem to have the most promising genetic traits or developmental trajectory with regard to health are selected for implantation. This is an image displayed from Cornell Chronicle, which includes 3 examples of human embryos at the blastocyst stage, photographed at different focal depths. So the top exhibits an embryo considered to be of good quality, and then fair in the middle, and then poor at the bottom according to an embryologist grading system. The selection of embryos based on genetic criteria can demonstrate an example of an overemphasis on risk reduction in medicine, which is described by scholars including Paul Schurz. And according to this, health alone becomes the highest good according to which decisions are analyzed, while in the process, foregoing or sacrificing other human goods. When health is considered as an ultimate good rather than a useful good toward an intellectual or moral flourishing beyond the self, the pursuit of bodily perfection can become an overwhelming, all-encompassing source of anxiety. In this instance, one could say that the good of health is being prioritized over the well-being of children. Another significant development to be aware of in assisted reproductive technology includes mitomyosis, the proof of concept of which was described in an article in Nature Communications. It's an experimental method of in vitro gametogenesis, or in other words, a laboratory gamete-creating procedure. Mitomyosis is a neologism that combines 2 terms referring to distinct processes of cell division, mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis involves cell division after chromosomal replication, resulting in a diploid nucleus, which has a full set of chromosomes. Sex cells undergo meiosis, which involves two occurrences of cell division that result in cells consisting of a haploid nucleus containing half the number of chromosomes. So mitomeiosis is intended to take place after somatic cell nuclear transfer, in which the nucleus of a somatic cell is deposited into the cytoplasm of a denucleated egg, and this creates an egg with a nucleus that contains the genetic material of the skin cell donor. In mitomeiosis, a nucleus of 46 chromosomes from a human somatic cell is prompted to divide without replicating its chromosomes, so the resulting nucleus may only contain 23 chromosomes, the same number of chromosomes as a gamete or a sex cell. The resulting newly synthesized egg could be joined to a sperm cell to create an embryo. While mitomeiosis would need to be further refined for consistency and accuracy, the significance of this technique is manifold. Mitomeiosis could render it possible for couples who could otherwise never have biological children to have access to functional gametes. These patients could potentially include postmenopausal women, men with azoospermia, or same-sex couples. So perhaps it could be that this method could be permissible if the gametes were returned to the integrated bodily and physiological spiritual experiences of the patient. But it's likely that this method could be used for IVF or for other types of contexts. And some even speculate perhaps creating embryos that could have traits similar to the ones of a person's AI partner to create a child that looks like it has the qualities that that AI partner has been given. So I've outlined the ways in which genetic testing, diagnosis, and manipulation can be utilized in the reproductive process. Many of these methods rely on the illicit means of in vitro fertilization. Nonetheless, major ethical questions for genetic engineering can still be pertinent to couples who do not rely on illicit methods such as in vitro fertilization, because it's theoretically possible for genetic editing technologies to be delivered by a viral vector to the developing embryo. So even though this isn't available right now, it's possible to develop this method. Though such methods are only hypothetical, and unfortunately perhaps less interest are paid to pursuing them due to the possibility of IVF, this could potentially provide a pathway for Catholic couples to provide genetic interventions to their children without IVF. And scientists have begun to investigate the possibility of using vectors to deliver genetic modifications in utero. For Catholics, genetic modification technologies would present an avenue for gestating a baby without genetic abnormalities that would not rely on assisted reproduction technologies that are condemned by the magisterium. So I'll look at some of the concerns for such an area of genetic interventions. And to frame this, it's helpful to consider the therapy enhancement distinction. So if you were at the talk yesterday, I mentioned the importance of the internal ends of medicine, that there are some goods that can be achieved through medicine, maybe reputation or to get a salary, but there's certain goods that define what medicine is that hopefully are at the center of the person who feels called specifically to the vocation of medicine because it defines it. And those are namely to heal the patient, to restore the patient to health, in other words, or to accompany the patient if cure is not possible. And there's some types of actions that fall out of this domain. So what the therapy enhancement distinction is describing is therapy refers to the types of actions that pursue those internal ends of medicine that are seeking to restore the patient to health. And then enhancement are procedures that are going beyond the given capacities of human nature. So it encompasses a discomfort with given human nature and the desire to add capacities to nature that the person doesn't already have. So a lot of people link the concerns with enhancement to also transhumanist concerns. which want to add new potencies to human nature. So one example of a transhumanist commitment would be to have an interest in radical life extension, which would disrespect the natural givenness of the body, including its dependency and finitude, in order to provide these new capabilities that don't necessarily have a grounding in a vision of what human flourishing looks like. So one frequently discussed method of genetic engineering involves CRISPR technology. CRISPR stands for Clustered Regulatory Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats, and Cas9 refers to the CRISPR-associated protein 9. And just to give a very broad overview, the technology essentially involves co-opting the immunity mechanism of bacteria in order to edit eukaryotic genomes. So in short, CRISPR-Cas9 functions as a cut-and-paste editing mechanism that can delete or insert genes at certain genomic target points. And so it could be a mechanism like CRISPR-Cas9, or there's other CRISPR technologies too, that would be delivered by the viral vector to the developing embryo. So I'll highlight some important magisterial considerations for genetic engineering. And the first is that we see a precedent for abiding to the commitment to therapy in the healthcare context. So this quote from Donum Vitae states that one must uphold as licit procedures carried out on the human embryo which respect the life and integrity of the embryo and do not involve disproportionate risks for it, but are directed towards its healing, the improvement of its condition of health, or its individual survival. So this shows that there is room for acknowledging when therapies could be licit that are for the benefit of the health of the embryo. There are certain types of therapies that are considered dangerous. One of these categories are those that are done on gametes or early stage embryos, or in other words, germline therapies, because these would be ones that would be inherited by the generations following. And the two main concerns that are highlighted are that these could potentially cause harm, that if there is an off-site mutation that would be inherited, that could be inherited by future progeny. And then it would, as you mentioned, necessarily involve assisted reproductive technologies. But as the state of the technology changes, these concerns shift, because it could be possible to demonstrate accuracy in the genetic technology, and it also could be possible that if using a viral vector, that this would bypass the use of in vitro fertilization. So it's also brought up the question of utilizing genetic technologies to strengthen the gene pool. So this would come under the category of enhancement interventions. And some of the concerns that Dignitas Personae brings up about the category of enhancement is that it promotes a discomfort of human finitude, it promotes a eugenic mentality, which I'll discuss more. It can increase social stigma that are attached to certain conditions that would be healed, or certain qualities that would be modified by genetic engineering. It's difficult to set limits. There can be arbitrary and questionable criteria. It can cause harm to the common good, especially in how it can interfere with the parent-child relationship or with social dynamics and the social understanding of the call to respond to human need, because it takes it from a person-to-person encounter to moving it to a technological intervention that it doesn't really involve a face-to-face encounter with the patient. And then the question of a domination of one person over the other, the person who is determining what genetic change should be made on the child. So while it might be easier to agree about the moral problems with enhancement interventions, I propose that we should not assume that all therapeutic interventions are morally equivalent. The means should be assessed according to whether they best serve the well-being of the patient, and whether some therapies interfere too much in individual uniqueness and the giftedness of the existence of the patient with genetic conditions. So I'll now turn to considering some of the ethical questions, including the following: eugenics, genetic reductionism, autonomy and human dignity, and then the formation of the parental gaze. First, with regard to eugenics, the question of what genetic therapies may be considered permissible extends to how clinical perspectives can fail to see the wholeness of a person and the fittingness of the other for relationship without any further qualification. Disability ethicists have questioned whether the gaze upon the human in the modern clinical setting has become inherently harmful. An increasingly pervasive model of medicine involves objectification and reduction of the human, with expectations for the body to work as unfailingly and efficiently as a machine. The pressures that contribute to eugenic undertones in medicine include those to conform to the economic engine and its desire for highly productive individuals that place the least cost on society. Christian churches have a tortuous history with the science of genetics. Some Protestant churches in the United States openly supported the problematic eugenics movement of the 1920s. And the eugenics movement, I have Francis Galton pictured because he was a thinker that is attributed to have first applied the use of probability to the developing science of genetics. And then there's also an image that depicts how in the 1920s eugenics was seen as a convergence from all of these other scientific fields of genealogy, medicine, statistics, anthropology, genetics, to try to promote the common good by helping people to seek the best health. But the problem with eugenics, and as we saw in the unfolding of eugenics programs, not only in the US, but other countries, including Germany, is that it involves subjective criteria for determining what constitutes the health of the community and what are advantageous qualities to have. But it also involves a utilitarian perspective of using the individual for the benefit of the whole and therefore overlooking the good of the individual. One of the sources from the Catholic Church that provided criticism of the eugenics movement can be seen in Casta Community, which was promulgated by Pius XI. And one of the main contributions that this document made is that eugenics shouldn't permit evil to be done that good may come of it. And it's from this document that says that eugenics should not be put above the higher order. It should be the case that science is always directed toward the good of the individual and not simply using the individual for some other good that doesn't benefit that patient. So it was neat to see how this document criticized the eugenic programs which prevented certain individuals from getting married and also utilized sterilization without consent. This document is criticizing those types of programs in order to want to showcase an alternative view of healthcare that's actually devoted to the well-being of individual patients. Genetic reductionism involves only valuing a person for their genetic qualities. So this is one of the major risks that comes from the eugenics movement. This can lead to both a eugenics endeavor of neglecting the well-being of those with genetic abnormalities, or on the other hand, perhaps a neglect of the proper use of therapies that could potentially heal genetic abnormalities on account of a desire to not change the identity of the patient, viewing it as solely of their genetic conditions. So there's two different concerns to avoid. One, a eugenics concern, but then also only viewing the patient as equivalent to their genetic condition alone. So this relates to some of the concerns and questions related to how disability relates to identity. And if we think of a lot of the patient narratives that we encounter or in ourselves or among our family members, it's important to consider how disability often mediates a person's experiences with the world and with their relationships. And there's some really helpful work by various scholars who point out, Michael Dean being an example, that there should be changes in the healthcare setting to help to integrate the perspective of patients with disabilities and their families. One, that counseling, including genetic counseling, is informed by the perspectives of experiences of members of the disability community, and also to promote and increase direct interactions between the medical and disability communities by having disability rights advocates on hospital ethics committees, for example. And I have a story to help illustrate the importance of these considerations from a disability perspective. Deanna Smith hoped that the first time she would finally behold her child, all her problems would be solved. Her daughter had received a diagnosis of Down syndrome. Smith was sure her daughter's diagnosis would bring obstacles to her own long-anticipated dreams as a parent, challenges to her child, and to both mother and daughter in different ways, a life of difficulty. Smith describes her frustration after delivering her daughter. I felt very disconnected. I didn't get to hold her. I didn't even really get to see her because I was hoping that I would just take one look at her face and think, I can't believe I thought all of those things. Of course she's perfect and she's my baby, but I didn't get to look at her face. Smith was unable to see her child's face because it was covered by equipment. Her daughter Addison needed special medical attention after she was first born. 20 weeks prior, the child's face was veiled by a womb rather than machinery. Her eyes unseen, her smile waiting on the wings, and her infant personality yet to unfold. It was in the midst of that mystery that Smith received news perceived as most revealing of her child's identity, her diagnosis. In the time since the birth of her daughter, Smith experienced a change of perspective on Down syndrome, an authentic metanoia. Her love for her child, an unraveling of experiences that generated happy memories, and the discovery of new dreams inspired her to advocate for children with Down syndrome and their families. Her work merited an invitation to speak at the United Nations 63rd Commission on the Status of Women, and Archbishop Bernardino Uzza had commended the honorable efforts of one of the panelists in such a way that reflected the endeavors of all present when he said that through your work, we hope for the day that everyone will say that kind of society they want to live in is one in which every child is welcomed with love and helped to grow to his or her full potential. The hesitancy of parents of children with Down syndrome to entertain the notion of a cure does not simply amount to a divide between parental intuition and academic opinion. Though Down syndrome is only one of an immense number of conditions or diseases that can be prenatally diagnosed, the perspectives of these parents provide a window into the distress of a perceived choice between loving one's child and helping one's child. The advent of CRISPR-Cas9 and similar genetic engineering technologies render the possibility of clinical therapies involving genetic modifications for such conditions more likely. Still, many parents question the morality of invasive types of therapies that seem to threaten the very identity of the child. One mother writes, I think my concern here is that to take away the third chromosome that causes trisomy 21 is to take away more than my daughter's ear tubes and pronated feet and impulsivity, but rather it's to take away something essential to who she is. It brings up the question of the relationship to autonomy and human dignity, and a lot of scholars that are weighing these questions that arise look at it as the autonomy of the parent in choosing what qualities they want in their child or what child they want to raise, in tension with the human dignity of the child. And one helpful approach to consider is that of Edmund Pellegrino, who argues that there should be a return in understanding autonomy as the interpretation of self-governance toward what is right, rather than making one's own preferences the determining factor of right and wrong. And through this vision of autonomy, it's possible to see much more of the consistency that autonomy can be used to determine how to respect human dignity, rather than seeing only a tension between them. I would like to look at the French geneticist Jerome Lejeune as an important example for thinking through these questions as well. And he was an example of a physician who honored the dignity of each of his patients, even the most disadvantaged, yet never surrendered his pursuit to heal. And he was in fact the one who had discovered the cause of trisomy 21, the cause of Down syndrome. And he wanted to use this insight to help to develop therapies for children who were diagnosed with this condition, but also to assist with early diagnosis too. And he was horrified when he discovered that his discovery was used instead to determine children who had Down syndrome in order to abort them. But he provides a good example of someone who identifies the goods and the internal ends of medicine and how to use developments of technology to help to pursue true therapies. So I also don't want to lose the example of the parental vocation that involves a radical hospitality to the unknown, but also that involves a responsibility to lovingly greet the visitor of the new child. And this is an example that we don't want to lose in our age of healthcare that does involve features like IVF that promote a different type of perspective between the parent and the child. So some of these important parental responsibilities that inform the gaze of the mother and father toward their child involve first a theology of gift, of acknowledging the child as a gift that's given rather than a product to be made. Second, that a desire for a child is natural and is a good intention, but that a child is not a right, but rather an aspiration. And I'll talk a bit too about how the crosses of the experiences of infertility and of those very true desires for parents to want to have a child can also bear spiritual fruit and a motivation to offer one's spiritual parenthood to their community. It also helps to acknowledge how the parental gaze can motivate the scientific innovation that can help to restore health to parents and might provide for therapies that can help infertile couples to overcome their infertility and possibly have a child, but not to undermine the embodied theological structure of life's welcoming. So I've demonstrated two main contexts to which to respond for considering genetic interventions that are used at the beginning of life. One is the context of infertility, which can often draw people to look at solutions like IVF, and the other is the context of questions regarding disability and its connections to identity. To respond to the context of infertility, I'll utilize a theology of vocation as a calling into the unknown, and to respond to the context of disability, I'll draw from the theology of St. Edith Stein. In the Gospel of Luke, Elizabeth interpreted and announced her fetal child's joy in the presence of his even more minuscule cousin, John the Baptist, who offered his first prophetic witness from within the womb of his mother. Beginning from conception, each new human retells the story of biological development experienced by Christ himself. A pregnant woman receives the profound grace to contemplate the Savior's humility. But before he left within her womb, Elizabeth was merely hoping for John. In the stillness before his presence, she yearned for a child during years of infertility. Many hopeful parents will meet her in this pain, but will never experience the long-awaited miracle. To be a person means you are made in the image of God and eternally destined to offer love through a gift of self. The embryo has this eternal destiny. That is, she is a person even before she can breathe or move or speak up. The development of human life has been sanctified by Christ, and therefore it is unjust for the gift of a person's existence to be controlled by another human. There are certain interventions that are not fitting for the dignity of the person encountered even in embryonic form. The embryo's personhood takes precedence over the wishes of her parent. To refrain from utilizing IVF and other technologies that separate the creation of life from the marital act is in fact a sacrificial act of love for human life. Even if a person never has biological children, a person who declines IVF lovingly exemplifies that life should never be reduced to the object of a desire. In fact, an important chapter of the gospel of life is lived by infertile couples, single persons, and those who grieve children lost. Their stories of discipleship honor the gift of life and witness to love, even over tender desires for parenthood. We should acknowledge the reality of this cross, as well as the reality that all crosses involve a lesson for the rest of the world, for those who don't carry that cross, as well as hidden graces for the cross bearers. And it's also important to acknowledge the beauty of adoption, which theologians hold up as the paradigm of our own, every person's relationship to God as adopted children by God. And what a great day to think about adoption on the Feast of St. Joseph. Edith Stein's writing can be a helpful resource for navigating questions now about the relationship between disability and personal identity. And she's a 20th century philosopher who became a Carmelite nun. On the question of human individuality, Stein was intent to hold true to the Christian concept of individual uniqueness before God. She understood that the implications of the idea that we each play a unique role in the body of Christ were not fully developed in philosophical pursuits of understanding the human person. Stein wished to take seriously that each person is made through the intention of a loving creator. Furthermore, she exhibited trust that God constantly works within a person's life to call the individual into personal relationship with him. She writes, "What did not lie in my plan lay in God's plan. And the more often such things happen to me, the more lively becomes in me the conviction that of my faith, that from God's point of view, nothing is accidental, that my entire life, even in the most minute details, was pre-designed in the plans of divine providence, and is thus for the all-seeing eye of God a perfect coherence of meaning. It is reasonable to presume that the same type of relationship to a providential plan can occur with accidents in the ontological sense." She writes that the person's nature or his life's course are no gift or trick of chance, but seen with the eyes of faith, the work of God. It is he who calls each individual to that which he or she is called personally. Many Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophers end discussion about disability with identifying it as an accident of the human condition. In other words, this technical philosophical categorization in and of itself would render disability as inessential to human identity. One can remove disability without removing something essential to what it means to be human. Stein allows us to consider a more complex question about the relationship of disability to the person. Even if disability can be considered an accident relative to the human form, can it really be considered an accident in relation to the individual form as associated with one particular body? Can one remove disability without removing something essential to what it means to be this human? For many individuals, disability is seen as mediating the ways in which an individual comes to know oneself, the world around them, and even one's relationship with God. The notions that accidents do not contribute to personal identity can only be true in considering accidents from the vantage of a higher ontological category than the individual. And this certainly does not render qualities that fall into this category of accident from this vantage insignificant or meaningless for an individual. Thus, an accident should not be considered as that which can be removed to better identify a person, unless the person of which we are speaking is the essence of all persons as a whole. In fact, accidents, even if they do not derive from an essence, play an integral role in expressing the distinctiveness of an individual to the beholder. For Stein, a part of the soul contributes to the individuality of the person. She refers to this part of the soul as the core of the soul in her essays collected in Philosophy of Psychology and the Humanities, and the individual form or essential form of the individual being in her work Finite and Eternal Being. This core cannot be changed, except perhaps by God, but unfolds with time. The person receives his or her form from this deepest interiority. Though the soul as form is not meant to be independent from its matter, Stein sees in the encounter of the soul before God something quite remarkable. She writes that when our earthly life ends and everything transitory falls away, then every soul will know itself as it is known before God, and the what, the why, and the whither which God had in mind when he created this personal soul. And this is essential in the status which it has attained in the orders of nature and grace by virtue of its free choices." End quote. Though the soul may be incomplete without the body, God devotes intention, attention, and love in the creation of each soul. The soul before God is loved as precious and unique. One's uniqueness resounds in all aspects of one's being. The contribution of Stein's philosophy of the core of the soul and its existence in the mode of essential being offers important insights for determining the permissibility of various medical interventions. On the one hand, it allows for an assurance that even if an intervention has the potential to drastically alter the matter of a human person, the most important aspect of the person's identity will be preserved. Even after physical modification, the core of the person has not changed. Stein's philosophy therefore provides room for the moral permissibility of therapy, while also acknowledging for the person who experiences life with their disability that this is a graced existence and that their journey is one that disability is part of their vocational journey to God. Disability indeed may mean certain potencies go unactualized, but with the effect that other types of potencies are actualized in their stead. So for Edith Stein, the experience of disability isn't just a story of missing out on capacities, because there's other capacities that could be honed. Stein recognizes this when she describes the properties of the community of persons with blindness as not blindness in itself, because one cannot say that the abstract concept of a community is blind. Rather, the shared properties of this community are born out of the individual member's blindness. She writes, "It can be very well that this group possesses properties that are necessitated by the blindness of the individuals and that are to be found in no community of sighted people, such as the inner calm that give blind people an insulation from the bewilderment of the visible world. Nonetheless, it's also possible for some types of therapies to disrespect the gift of the unique person. And for this reason, genetic intervention may be permissible for some life-threatening conditions, but it's important to consider the needs of what therapies fit the particular condition, and that there's some conditions that should instead receive a relational therapy, that it wouldn't be proper to provide a therapy in utero. But Stein's understanding of the human person in this structure provides some really helpful insight for clarifying more what the relationship between disability and identity is. To return to Psalm 139, "My bones are not hidden from you. When I was being made in secret, fashioned in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw me unformed. In your book, all are written down. My days were shaped before one came to be." Though genetic interventions at the beginning of life hold promises for offering authentic healthcare, we must also be attentive to the ways in which some genetic therapeutic intentions can offer a distorted view of the human person and lead us to forget our reliance on God's providence. Yet, our days are also shaped by a loving design of God that welcomes us to participate in his own continual act of care and creation by offering our innovations in witness to his compassion. May this commitment to the dignity of the child and reliance on grace help us to navigate the distinctions between permissible genetic therapy and the impermissible. Thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to discussing this topic.
Thank you again to Dr. Courtois. What questions do we have that we want to kick off our discussion with?
Thanks, Marielle. So a question moving beyond the uterus. In a lot of the theology of disability that you discussed, what would be the ethics of parents pursuing pluripotent gene therapy to address their child's congenital deafness and blindness? Right, because it is not done in utero, but there is a debate whether or not those things should be corrected. But in light of everything you said, if a parent came to you and said, "I have a child who has congenital deafness, there's this new gene therapy that can literally cure it. Is this ethically appropriate?"
Yeah. So the reason why I think Edith Stein is helpful is because it permits the acknowledgement that that type of therapy can be morally permissible, because it's the material changes to the person aren't affecting the underlying core of the person as gifted by God, while also acknowledging that maybe for whatever reason the therapy fails, or the person just doesn't have access to that therapy. It doesn't mean that God is still at work in the journey of that person with that disability. So that would be an example of returning the person to health, of restoring the capacity of the person to function normally, while also allowing for the fact that if a person isn't able to receive that therapy, that doesn't mean that there's a divine grace at work in their life on account of living that experience with disability. So I think it helps to meet some commitments that one would want to hold on both sides of that question, to honor the dignity of those who experience disability, but then to also acknowledge where there can be very clear applicability of therapies that help to restore the person to proper health and to proper functioning.
And if I could follow up on that, what about the other side of the equation, which is where the deaf community would say actually is almost like a kind of deaf genocide, right? You're eliminating a whole kind of community of people who've built up this language, way of communicating, and so on. And so in some sense, to do that would be to eliminate their common good of the community that they've built up.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question, because this is something that's brought up with many communities of persons that have certain disabilities, and this is what parents of Down syndrome also talk about, that if it was the case that the population did not have persons with Down syndrome in it, that there would be a loss of the beauty and of the distinct personality that they offer. So I think that it's on the first point that I would like to make is that in general, the approach to healthcare should involve a continual discussion to learn about the experiences of persons with disabilities in order to determine what proper therapies look like. Because there can be cases where certain interventions are presumed to be beneficial that aren't actually beneficial to that person. And one example can be surgically removing bone spurs from persons who might have deformities and trying to fit them into prosthetics that are actually really uncomfortable, and they would rather not have prosthetics. But this is getting to a question of wanting a more objective approach of what therapies should be provided for children who are blind or who have other conditions. And I think that it's possible to utilize an approach to healthcare that both acknowledges the experience and the story of the patient, while also having an objective view of wanting to restore the patient to a normative sense of health, which would permit healing persons with disability or deafness. But this would be an example of where these instances of healing would affect an understanding of a community of the experiences and opportunities that they've been given in light of that disability. So it's sort of a paradox in the sense of, I would argue personally that it would be permissible to provide these therapies while also acknowledging the fact that we see God's providence at work in the experiences of persons with these disabilities in their communities that have witnessed to the goods that have come to them, just as Edith Stein has described in her own descriptions and experiences of persons with disabilities. So I know that's a paradoxical answer, but.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for another great talk. All right, I was thinking the exact same things that Raphael and David were, so apologies, but I'm going to follow up again on that. I'll put it this way, I'm curious about that claim, right? I'm just not entirely confident that we are permitted to like, and even that language of like healing blindness or deafness in a child who is not yet at a place in life where he or she can discern whether that's an essential or accidental like feature of her life, right? I mean, the philosopher Elizabeth Barnes at Virginia, she actually argues against this. And if you right? If you actually remove the deafness and turn the child into a hearing person, you didn't just remove something accidental, you removed something essential. And, you know, I mean, like connected to like that almost like cultural genocide claim that David mentioned.
Quasi, I mean, come on.
Quasi-genocide, yeah, be careful with our language. But, I mean, I assigned my students an article that talks about the ethnocide of the deaf community for cochlear implants, being done by cochlear implants. But, you know, there's, just in those sort of treatments, you will also communicate, besides possibly removing something essential from the individual, you're also sending a cultural message that, like deafness or blindness or whatever the disability, or Down syndrome, whatever the disability is, isn't just a mere difference, right? But it's actually a bad difference, and we should think about it in terms of something that should be healed, cured, or eliminated.
Yeah. And I have a lot to say on this question. One of the frameworks that I think is helpful in addition to Stein, because like I mentioned, she views accidents as having a different weight than merely an Aristotelian or Thomistic approach would. So even if a particular accidental quality is not something that coheres in the core of the person's identity, it's something that is essential to our experience and our encounter of that individual, because that's how we come to identify and to know that individual, and that's also mediating how they come to know themselves. So there's a distinction to be made with these. One category is potencies that Edith Stein uses, and I didn't go into as much explanation about that, but she helps to offer a theory where you can acknowledge that there are good potencies that are actualized in the experience of disability. So it's important to draw distinctions that in offering therapy, one is not negating the positive potencies that are actualized in the experiences of persons with disabilities and in the experiences of communities that share that disability. But it's also important to be able to preserve a view of healthcare that is a response to suffering. And so that's part of navigating what healthcare is to do, is to try to acknowledge the pursuit of healing while also bringing into it the experience and the story of the individual. That helps to determine when certain therapies are permissible or when certain therapies are disrespectful of the dignity of the person. But I think the theological anthropology that Edith Stein offers and the theology that John Paul II offers about disability is really helpful. And I think that John Paul II highlights a mix of mere difference, negative difference, and positive difference, in the sense that persons with disabilities and persons without disabilities, there's a mere difference in the case that everybody has human dignity, and everybody therefore is to be treated as a beloved child of God. One can acknowledge from the medical perspective that there can be a negative difference because any person with disability still requires standard of care and requires accompaniment, and it's acknowledging ways that the community can help that individual or to ensure that the fullness of their gifts and their capacities are actualized and offered to that community. That's the responsibility of the community, to seek the common good and to ensure that there's access for persons with disabilities and that they can fully participate. But there's also, interestingly for JP2 and from a theological perspective, also a positive difference, which is something that's also highlighted by disability scholars, and that there's an insight into human nature and the understanding of the person and the giftedness of God's providence and the lessons and virtues that come from living a life of disability that one might not experience or encounter in other ways, that it's providing another glimmer of the fullness of God's creative powers and of God's goodness that is shined in the life of persons with disabilities that provide, again, that chapter of the book of life that isn't told in any other way. So I think it's important to maintain that there's a positive difference aspect as well, that can help to prevent this idea of, it's really a call to healthcare to acknowledge the dignity of persons with disabilities and to navigate some of these evident tensions that are brought up, especially in genetic ethics, of wanting to be committed to heal, but also to be committed to the truth of the patient's story and the dignity of persons with disabilities too. So that's a couple of different threads that I would use to start to answer that question.
What is the best way to go about like dialoguing with people who have like been conceived via IVF or like received some of these like enhancement procedures?
Yeah. And yeah, the main part of my talk was sort of providing the underlying frameworks to be considered that might lead a person to consider IVF, because that can be a context where these questions of genetic ethics arise. And we see from the transhumanist movement that there's more of an interest in wanting to look into how to enhance the person, or how to improve IQ, or how to improve physical function beyond the norm. And one step that I would make is that it should never be the case that it's overlooked or forgotten that every single person is beloved by God and has the depths and the fullness of human dignity. And there's a lot of different ways that persons might be conceived, but this does not change the fact that they are beloved and they have the fullness of dignity to affirm that. And that allows for acknowledging the depths of the desires of a parent and the authenticity of those desires to want to have a child, to then talk about what are the various means that are fitting toward the depths of that desire and for the dignity of the potential children. And I think questions of enhancement can be approached by thinking about what are the fundamental goods of the human life and what do we want to fully celebrate about the human life. Because if we limit that perspective solely to bodily goods, then that can become a distraction and actually a means of anxiety that doesn't allow a person to pursue fuller and higher goods. So if one is constantly anxious or is so taken by the pursuit of wanting to ensure that their child is physically fit beyond the human norm, then that also takes away the human good of being able to engage in the virtue of hospitality and of openness and of receiving the gift of the other through God's providence that you otherwise wouldn't be able to participate in. And then also might affect a community's values in such a way that focuses just on bodily goods to the extent of missing out on the goods of communion and of relationship and being attentive to these goods beyond those of the body alone.
So as a nurse or going into nursing, I know that like it's our responsibility for advocating for our patient and for the mom. And so in that scenario, I'm guessing like, would we have to bring all the options to the table to the patient and then letting them decide, or should we meet with the doctor, the mom, the dad, and we're advocating for all of them, but also like the ethical side of like their feelings and like caring for them, because you're talking about like anxiety and being anxious. And so we're supposed to be there, but also on the other side, we're also trying to care for them as a whole. And so like how would that conversation go, and how do you think that would be into?
So you're thinking more of on the emotional side, acknowledging the anxiety while also trying to help provide a response to it?
Yes, like options, like we were supposed to be there and like reinforce and educate and let them know like, hey, these are all our options. But at the same time, like IVF clinics, like I know they have that, but also the nurses are informing and educating, and you also have your own like opinion, but you're not supposed to have your own opinions like that. So I'm guessing like, how do you go about being there for your patient, but also being there ethically, if that makes sense?
I would make an argument, and I'm drawing from some other bioethical thinkers like Edmund Pellegrino, that you actually have a moral responsibility to bring your opinion into the clinic. And there's some alternative views that might say that you should leave your commitments or your conscience at the door and you're just supposed to be neutral toward the patient. but a fullness of, a full perspective of vocation involves acknowledging that the person entering into the vocation is bringing the fullness of themselves, including their convictions and their heart and their values and their loves. And so in your relationship with the patient, you therefore have a responsibility that in order to demonstrate your fullness of love for them, to offer one's professional opinion about what are some of the disadvantages or advantages of the different options. And of course you wouldn't want to use means of doing that would be coercive, so you wouldn't want to use an unfair emotional appeal to do that, or you wouldn't want to scare them in such a way that affects their ability to intellectually grasp the concepts to allow them to come to their decision. But the healthcare professional would have an obligation to provide in a professional and caring and loving and empathetic way a contextualization of what are the potential advantages and disadvantages of those, which one would argue that that is helping to provide the fullness of truth to the patient to allow them to make a decision based off of that information. And sometimes that might be particular to the specific role. So sometimes there's, some healthcare professionals will be more involved in those discussions than others, or there might be prudent moments or times to have those discussions. But I do think that, again, Edmund Pellegrino and a lot of other scholars would view that it's important to acknowledge the respect toward professional conscience and to allow for the person to bring the fullness of who they are into their profession.
At this point, I'll claim the privilege of the microphone. You had spoken earlier about the parental gaze and about how IVF can treat the child as a product to be manufactured and an object of contract in a way that compromises the cultivation of the proper parental gaze. And I was wondering if you could say more on that and how that happens.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of ways that we come to know our vocation. I brought up the importance of exemplars in my talk from yesterday, and one can make an argument that in order to discern what are the responsibilities of a particular vocation, you learn a lot from the people around you who are already living that vocation. And to think, and I talked yesterday too about there being a particular gaze of the patient on the healthcare professional and vice versa, the gaze of the healthcare professional on the patient, and that's something that AI should not intervene with or something that we lose if it's the case that someone is replaced by AI. So shifting to now consider the context of the parent-child relationship, the gaze of the parent upon the child, there's a very different characterization that comes about if the parent is viewing the child as a gift, that's something that's not determined by their own will or is not shaped by their own preferences, versus the idea that a child might be a means of entertainment or something to, a capstone to the life that they have lived, or as a project that they're supposed to perfect, or that perhaps they even view themselves in competition with other families to have children or to have their children have certain successes. And I think you can make an argument that the technocratic paradigm, like I mentioned previously, affects a lot of different types of human relationships, but very much can be identified as affecting also the parent-child relationship, of simply viewing the child as an object, as a space in which one is projecting their own preferences or demands in a machine-like way, and even utilizing some technological means of having the child can also further objectify that relationship. So I think it's important to think about how we tell stories of discerning to become parents, because that can help the next generation in viewing that the vocation of marriage and the vocation of parenthood is something that is on the whole a gift, and because it's a vocation, it's something that is a journey that's meant to shape you, that you're not supposed to be perfect upon entering into the vocation, but the vocation is what God's going to use to teach you the lessons of love that you don't know yet. And the story that we tell of a person's coming to be, or of entering into a marital relationship, or of having a child, becomes a really big way that the child views their personal identity, comes to know themselves, comes to know their other relationships. And so the story of IVF is telling a different type of story than other types of stories would. So that's why I think contemplating the gaze of the parent on the child, and even prior to having the child, the dreams and aspirations of the parent and what they look like, are helpful in seeing how the technocratic paradigm can encroach upon that relationship and interfere with it potentially to create a different type of gaze, where it's a gaze of control and desire rather than one that's open and wanting to be hospitable and showing an unconditional love, even if it's the case that those dreams don't come true, that the person may not have their own biological children.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I'd like to humbly make a comment. Don't really have a question. I love the parental gaze concept. However, it doesn't just happen when the child is conceived. It happens throughout the child's entire life. And as a physician who's taking care of adult and pediatric disabled people, as well as having a child that has a disability, one thing I've learned to improve the communication of honoring those people is the wordage that we use in healthcare. It used to be called handicapped. That got out of there. Y'all may know this already, I don't know. Then it got to be disabled. But the preference in rehab medicine is to call them exceptionality. And you know, sometimes the power of words can make a difference.
Yeah. No, I definitely think that that's really true. And there's a lot of discussions too, that there's even was discussion of a shift that some persons with disabilities in their community preferred person first language, like referring to persons with disabilities, and then more recently there was a shift back to using quality first language, so disabled persons, to acknowledge that that's a descriptor of, you know, an aspect of themselves that they're proud of, and that is part of their identity. But I think that that's really important to acknowledge that the language that is used is important, and that it is another way of telling the story of the truth of that person. So thanks so much for making that comment.
The question of the meaning of the personhood and the life people conceived by IVF, I think it's a really important. I'm distracted by this last question that I also have some thoughts on. So I'm trying to circle back to where I was. I appreciated one of the opening comments that you made was about the dignity of every person, however they arrive here. And I think that in any conversation like this, that's a really important question and matter to start with, is the meaning of the life of the person who is conceived by IVF. And a layer beyond that is donor conceived. And there are all these people in every group. Increasingly, there are more and more people who have arrived here that way. And so talking about the meaning, not just the parents' relationship to the differences in the relationship, but what does it mean to be IVF conceived? What does it mean to be donor conceived on top of that? Because there's so many more people in any given gathering that arrived here that way. And I think, and again, you gave a nod to it at the beginning, but I think that deserves even more comment and discussion as we have these conversations. Question?
I think it is something that is important to emphasize, that one should acknowledge that there are increasingly more people that are conceived by IVF, and also to not make the mistake that their parents love them any less, that they truly love their children. But I think it's possible to have a theological and academic discussion about the means, and just as anyone would do with various types of interventions in the clinic, of what are fitting toward the dignity of that child, and what fits with these different debates about the vision of healthcare and of paradigms of healthcare, without saying anything that would seem to neglect or demote the dignity of those children, and again, the fullness of the belovedness of those children, and of the parents that are engaging in that. But I also think it could be an opportunity to have these discussions more widely, so that parents are aware of these various questions and concerns if and when they do experience infertility. A lot of people have talked about how experiences of infertility aren't talked about as frequently in the parish setting, or even in other institutions like the academic setting, even though it's experienced by a lot of people. And then when they are in the difficult situation of trying to have a child and they haven't yet conceived a child, that they might not have the framework, or they aren't aware of some of the discussions having to do with the available technologies. So there definitely could be some further opportunities to have these discussions in academic settings and in parish settings to help people feel more prepared for entering into those discussions with one another.
And then this will be our last question.
I know one of the things you touched on is like embryo selection in IVF. So I was wondering what AI's effects are on that, as well as like, I guess what I've seen is like, or read about is like AI being the thing that's selecting the embryos.
Right.
So is there kind of a concern about AI like actually developing us as a human race instead of us being the ones that are
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because there are a lot of ethical concerns about utilizing AI to help determine which embryos to then implant. And so this highlights several different categories of concerns, including, is the AI data, does it have implicit biases in it? And is it therefore possibly promoting a eugenics program, even in ways that the human developers, the persons who are using it, might not notice? And one can also have questions too, not just about the data set, but then also it's might be interfering again with human prudence in a decision that is literally choosing among children to determine which are going to be implanted in the mother. But you brought up the question of AI choosing which children are to be implanted rather than a person, and even have questions about AIs developing other AIs. So it's another example of this distancing of the person from a very pivotal choice. And even if someone might have a different ethical stance on IVF, that would probably be another domain of concern and anxiety of using AI in that setting.
Well, let's say thank you one more time, Dr. Unfortunately, that's about all the time we have for the official part. However, the conversations don't have to end here. Be sure to continue them. There's still food in the back. Also, be sure to fill out the survey for it's important to us to know what you thought of the lecture. Your feedback is very, very helpful. Thank you all very much for coming out this morning. Thank you to Dr. Hannah Ragusa, without whom this lecture would not have happened. She's also passing out QR codes for the survey. So if you can't scan it here, you can scan it on the paper. Thank you again to Dr. Courtois. Please
help yourself to some food. And if you're here for the Reach badge, please see Professor Risha. Thank you all very much.